The ship did not announce itself. It moved into the Pearl River estuary, the way all the others did, slow, deliberate, carrying the particular patience of something that knows it will not be refused. The year was 1830, though the year hardly matters. The ship had made this journey before. So had the one before it. So had the one before it. The Chinese customs officers came aboard, as they always did. They walked the deck. They checked the manifest. The manifest listed cotton, wool, lead. The kinds of things a trading empire sends when it wants to appear reasonable. They did not check the lower holds. No one did. This was not an oversight. It was a system, one that had taken years to build and considerably less effort to maintain. The officers knew the ship. They knew the company behind it. And somewhere between knowledge and action, there existed a gap, narrow, precise, and perfectly sufficient. Money had made the gap. Money kept it open. In the lower holds, wrapped in oilskin and packed in wooden chests, stamped with the seal of the British East India Company, were approximately 40 chests of opium. Each chest weighed around 60 kilograms. Each chest, once distributed through the networks already in place along the Pearl River Delta, would find its way into the pipes of several hundred men. And those men would find their way back. They always did. Canton had rules about this. The Qing dynasty had issued edicts, 17 of them, at last count, forbidding the import and sale of the drug. The emperor's position was unambiguous. His officials nodded in agreement. Then they went back to the docks. The British were polite about it. This was perhaps the most unsettling part. They did not force the trade. They did not threaten. They offered and waited. And when the answer came back in the form of a hand extended in the dark, they placed something in it and kept their own names off the ledger. The East India Company did not sell opium in China. It sold opium at auction in Calcutta. What happened after that was, officially, someone else's business. On the dock at Canton, a clerk recorded the ship's arrival. Cotton, wool, lead. He stamped the paper, filed it, and moved on to the next vessel already waiting in the river. Below him, the chests were being unloaded in the dark. No one watched. No one was meant to. And the system, careful, patient, impeccably maintained, continued exactly as designed. The British had a problem, and the problem was tea. Not the drinking of it. That part was going extraordinarily well. By 1800, Britain was consuming 20 million pounds of Chinese tea per year. It had become less a preference and more a biological fact, woven into the architecture of the working day, the afternoon, the morning, the evening. The empire ran on it. Everyone understood this, and no one found it particularly alarming. The alarming part was the silver. China wanted very little that Britain made. This was not rudeness. It was simply true. The Qing emperor had said as much in a letter to King George III in 1793, with the particular patience of someone explaining something obvious to someone who should already know it. China possessed all things in prolific abundance. Foreign goods, the emperor noted, were not a necessity. The letter was polite. It was also, from Britain's perspective, a problem that required a solution. The solution for now was silver. Britain bought tea with silver, and the silver left and did not return. The same was true of silk, of porcelain. Every luxury that made its way from Chinese ports to British drawing rooms took with it a portion of the empire's reserves, and the reserves were not infinite. Someone in London understood this. Several someones. They met in rooms and looked at numbers, and the numbers were, without exception, moving in the wrong direction. The East India Company had been thinking about this for some time. It controlled vast territories in India. It had administrators, armies, supply chains of remarkable sophistication. It also had, in the fields of Bengal and Bihar, something that grew with very little encouragement and sold in certain markets for considerable sums. The poppy had been cultivated in India for centuries. The company had simply made the arrangement more efficient. The logic was clean, once you accepted its premises. Britain needed something China would buy. India could produce it. China had laws against it, but China also had officials, and officials had needs, and needs had prices. The system in Canton had already demonstrated that laws and commerce could coexist without ever quite touching each other. What the company needed was scale. In 1773, it assumed a monopoly over opium production in Bengal. It did not advertise this. There was no announcement, no ceremony. A monopoly, once established, tends to explain itself through subsequent events. And the subsequent events over the following decades would be, from a purely commercial standpoint, quite successful. In London, the ledgers slowly began to correct themselves. The silver that had been flowing east started, gradually, to change direction. No one in the drawing rooms noticed the difference. The tea was still warm. The afternoons were still quiet. And somewhere in the Pearl River Delta, a system that had begun as a workaround was becoming something considerably more permanent. In March, the fields of Bihar turned white. Not from frost. The season was already warm, the air carrying the particular heaviness of a subcontinent preparing for heat. The white came from the flowers. Thousands of them, opening across the flatlands in a silence that had nothing ominous about it. They were, by any honest measure, beautiful. Farmers had been growing them here for generations, and before the company arrived, the arrangement had been simple enough. Cultivation, local sale, modest profit, repetition. A crop like any other. The company changed the terms. Not violently. That distinction mattered to the men who wrote the contracts. Farmers in Bengal and Bihar were now required to grow poppy on a fixed portion of their land, sell the harvest exclusively to company agents, at prices the company set, and accept advances that bound next season's crop before this one had been processed. The arrangement had a name, the advances system, and the name made it sound like generosity. It was in practice a mechanism that made exit nearly impossible. A farmer who accepted the advance owed the company. A farmer who owed the company grew poppy. A farmer who grew poppy accepted the next advance. The processing happened in Patna and Ghazipur, in factories that operated with the unhurried precision of institutions that expect to exist for a very long time. The raw opium, a dark, bitter resin scraped from the scored heads of the flowers, was weighed, graded, mixed with inferior material to standardize consistency, then shaped by hand into balls, roughly the size of a large orange. Each ball was coated in dried poppy leaves and left to cure. Rows of them, thousands at a time, sitting in long ventilated halls under the supervision of company clerks, who recorded everything with the patience of men who understood that the record was the product. The balls were then packed into chests. 40 per chest. The chests were sealed, stamped, and moved to Calcutta, where they were auctioned, openly, legally, on British soil, to private merchants who understood exactly where they were going and exactly why the company, preferred not to deliver them directly. The arrangement gave everyone a degree of distance from the destination. Distance, in commerce, functions very much like innocence. The farmers did not attend the auctions. Most had never seen Calcutta. They knew the flour, the resin, the advance, the debt. Some had grown poppy their entire lives without fully understanding what became of it, which city it reached, which body received it, in what condition that body was returned. The company did not consider this relevant information for the people growing the crop. By the 1820s, the factories at Patna were producing close to 4,000 chests per year. By the 1830s, that number would more than double. The fields expanded accordingly. More white in March, more flowers opening in the heavy Bihar air, more farmers accepting the advance. The system was, by every metric the company tracked, performing exceptionally well. What the metrics did not track was what happened after Calcutta. That was officially someone else's territory, someone else's problem. Somewhere east of the Bay of Bengal, the chests were moving toward a coastline that still believed its edicts meant something. The flowers did not know this. They opened anyway, in March, as they always had. White and silent, and perfectly indifferent to what they had been made to mean. Canton was, by design, the only place in China where the world was permitted to enter. One city, one port, a single controlled aperture through which all foreign commerce was required to pass, monitored, taxed, and contained within a strip of land along the Pearl River waterfront, no wider than a few city blocks. The Qing dynasty had built this system deliberately, and for decades it had functioned more or less as intended. Foreign merchants arrived, traded under strict conditions, and left. They were not permitted to learn Chinese. They were not permitted to move freely through the city. They were not permitted to stay through winter. The gate, in other words, was a gate, and the dynasty believed, with considerable justification, that it controlled who passed through it. The system was called the Canton system, and its administrative backbone was the Kohong. The Kohong was a guild of licensed Chinese merchants, 13 firms at its peak, who held the exclusive right to trade with foreigners. Every transaction passed through them. Every negotiation, every complaint, every request from a foreign trader to the Chinese government had to travel through a Kohong merchant, who would carry it upward through the appropriate channels, at the appropriate pace, with the appropriate deference to a bureaucratic structure that had been refining itself for centuries. It was, in theory, an elegant arrangement. The foreigners traded. The Kohong profited. The dynasty maintained its distance from the barbarians at the gate, which was precisely where it believed barbarians belonged. What the system had not been designed for was a commodity that did not need the gate. Opium arrived by receiving ship. These were vessels anchored permanently outside Chinese territorial waters, off the island of Lintin, at the mouth of the Pearl River estuary, serving as floating warehouses from which smaller, faster boats collected the chests and moved them through the delta's intricate network of waterways. The boats knew the channels. The channels were not on any official map the dynasty consulted. By the time the opium reached Canton streets, it had passed through a dozen hands, none of whom appeared in any document the Kohong was required to file. The Kohong merchants knew this. Some of them were, with varying degrees of indirection, involved in it. The customs officials knew it too. The system that the dynasty believed was controlling foreign access to China was, in the specific matter of opium, functioning as something closer to a stage set, detailed, convincing, and built in front of something it was never meant to conceal. In Beijing, the emperor received reports from Canton. The reports described orderly commerce, appropriate revenues, foreigners conducting themselves within the prescribed boundaries. The reports were accurate, in the way that a description of the surface of a lake is accurate, true as far as it goes, and entirely silent about what moves beneath. The dynasty had spent generations perfecting the art of the controlled encounter with the outside world. It had built walls, literal and administrative, that had held for centuries. It had developed a vocabulary for foreign relations that placed China permanently at the center, the Middle Kingdom, receiving tribute, extending permission, condescending to engage. This was not arrogance exactly. It was a worldview that had been accurate for long enough to feel like a natural law. The chests moved through the delta at night. The gate stood where it had always stood, staffed and administered and carefully maintained. And the thing the gate had been built to stop was already, by this point, well inside. The pipe was not at first associated with ruin. In the early decades of the trade, opium smoking carried a certain social weight in Canton and the surrounding delta towns. Not respectability exactly, but proximity to it. It was expensive enough to signal means. It was foreign enough to suggest sophistication. The merchant class adopted it first, then the lower ranks of the civil service, then the soldiers tasked with enforcing the edicts against it. The irony of that last group was noted by almost no one at the time. It would be noted extensively later. The dens appeared gradually, the way permanent things tend to appear. One, then several, then enough that their presence stopped requiring explanation. They occupied back rooms, basement floors, the upper stories of buildings, whose ground floors conducted entirely legitimate business. The layout was consistent: low platforms, ceramic pillows, oil lamps burning at a specific angle to keep the resin workable. Men arrived in the evening and left, when they left, in a condition that the den's operators described, with practiced neutrality, as rested. The officials who filed reports to Beijing did not use the word epidemic. They used phrases like localized vice and containable practice and the weakness of certain moral constitutions. The language was precise in the way that language becomes precise when the person writing it understands that accuracy would require them to also describe their own failure to act. The reports traveled north through the bureaucratic channels of the Qing administration, arriving in the capital weeks later, already softened by distance and the particular grammar of institutional self-preservation. What the reports did not describe was the silver. A chest of opium, purchased at auction in Calcutta for roughly 500 rupees, sold in Canton for approximately 3 times that amount. The profit moved west, back toward the merchants, back toward the company's accounts, back toward London. What moved east in exchange was silver, Chinese silver, drawn from the same reserves the dynasty used to pay its armies, fund its administration, maintain the infrastructure of an empire that stretched across a continent. The drain was not yet visible in the streets. It was visible in the treasury records, for those permitted to read them. Very few were. By the late 1820s, the number of opium chests entering China annually had reached 30,000. The number of regular smokers in the Pearl River Delta alone was estimated, by the few officials willing to estimate, at somewhere between 1 and 2 million. The estimates varied because counting required acknowledgement, an acknowledgement required a response, and a response required resources that the administration was, quietly, beginning to struggle to locate. The streets of Canton knew something the reports did not say. They knew it in the particular way that streets know things, not as information, but as texture. In the way certain doorways began to smell. In the way certain men moved or stopped moving. In the way a neighborhood changes not all at once, but in small surrenders, each one barely worth noting, until one morning the accumulation becomes impossible to ignore. Canton had not reached that morning yet, but it was approaching it with the unhurried certainty of a tide that has already decided where it intends to arrive. The ships at Lintin sat low in the water, heavy with next month's supply. The lamps in the dens burned through the night. And somewhere in the delta, a man who had been a customs official for 11 years was smoking what he would later describe, in a confession no one requested, as his 14th pipe of the evening. If this story has settled somewhere unexpected, somewhere you did not expect a history to reach, alike is the quietest way to say so. The treasury records were kept in a building in Beijing that smelled of old lacquer and ink. They were maintained by men who had passed the imperial examinations, who understood classical texts, who could compose poetry in forms that had not changed in 1,000 years. They were not by training economists, but they could read a column of numbers, and by 1830 the columns were telling a story that required no classical education to understand. The silver was leaving. It had been leaving for years, and it was not coming back. For most of Chinese history, the trade balance had moved in China's favor. Foreign merchants arrived wanting silk, porcelain, tea, things China produced in abundance and the world could not easily replicate. They paid in silver, and the silver stayed. The empire accumulated it, the way empires accumulate the things they are owed, with the unhurried confidence of an entity that expects the arrangement to continue indefinitely. By the 1820s, that arrangement had reversed. China was now exporting silver and importing a substance that produced nothing, no goods, no labor, no taxable activity. Only appetite. The consequences moved through the economy in waves, each one slightly larger than the last. Silver was the basis of tax collection in the Qing system. Peasants paid taxes in copper cash, which local officials converted to silver before remitting upward through the administrative hierarchy. As silver drained from circulation, its value relative to copper rose. A peasant who owed the same nominal tax in silver now needed significantly more copper to pay it. The tax had not increased. The burden had. The distinction was invisible in the official records and entirely visible in the villages. The soldiers felt it too. Military salaries were paid in silver, and silver was becoming scarce enough that payments arrived late or short, or in denominations that local markets struggled to accept. An army paid irregularly is an army that begins to think about what it is paid to do, and whether the arrangement is worth maintaining. The Qing military had not been tested seriously in generations. It had, in the intervening years, developed certain habits that peace encourages and competence does not. In Canton, the merchant houses that had grown wealthy on legitimate trade were finding their margins compressed. The Kohong merchants, caught between foreign pressure and imperial regulation, were accumulating debts they could not discharge through legal means alone. Several had, quietly, found ways to be useful to the networks moving opium through the delta. This was not announced. It did not need to be. In a system under sufficient financial pressure, the illegal option tends to recommend itself without requiring anyone to say the word illegal out loud. The emperor received a memorial in 1838, a formal document from a senior official named Zhu Naiji, who proposed that opium be legalized, taxed, and thereby brought under state control. The argument was rational. The trade existed regardless of prohibition. The prohibition was costing the state revenue while failing to reduce consumption. Legalization, Xu Neiji suggested, would at least allow the silver to stay. It was the kind of argument that makes complete sense if you have already accepted that the thing cannot be stopped. The emperor rejected it. He was not wrong to. But the rejection required a response, a real one, not another edict. And the response, when it came, would be carried by a single man sent south, with the emperor's full authority and the particular burden of those who are asked to solve problems that have been left unsolved for too long. His name had not yet appeared in any of the reports. It would. The Emperor Daoguang was not, by temperament, a man who enjoyed difficult decisions. He was methodical, frugal, conscientious in the way that men are conscientious when they have inherited something they are afraid of losing. He wore robes that had been repaired rather than replaced. He reduced the number of dishes served at imperial banquets. He reviewed documents personally, in a hand that his officials described as careful, and his historians would later describe as the hand of a man who understood details and struggled with the larger shape of things. He had been emperor since 1820, and in that time he had issued more edicts against opium than any of his predecessors. The edicts had not worked. He had issued more edicts. By 1838, the situation had become impossible to manage through language alone. The memorials arriving from provincial officials described a country that was, in measurable and accelerating ways, coming apart at its administrative seams. Soldiers incapacitated. Clerks unreliable. Entire garrison towns where the majority of able-bodied men were spending portions of their income and portions of their working hours in the dens. One memorial, from a military commander in Guangdong, noted that he could not be certain how many of his own officers were affected, because the officers responsible for reporting such things were themselves under suspicion. The documents had a quality that official documents rarely achieve. It sounded genuinely frightened. Daoguang read it in the early morning, as he read most things, before the court assembled and the day acquired its formal architecture. He had, by this point, received hundreds of memorials on the subject. He had approved responses, rejected proposals, summoned officials, dismissed others. None of it had moved the numbers. The numbers continued to move themselves, in the direction they had chosen, with the indifference of processes that do not require permission to continue. The debate within the court had clarified, by late 1838, into two positions. The first, represented by Xu Neiji and a minority of pragmatists, held that prohibition had failed, that legalization with taxation was the only realistic path to recovering the silver drain, and that a government that cannot enforce a law should consider whether the law is serving any purpose beyond the appearance of resolve. This position was rational. It was also, in the context of the imperial court, essentially unsayable. To legalize opium was to admit that China had been defeated by a substance introduced illegally by foreign merchants, and that admission carried implications about sovereignty and strength that the dynasty was not prepared to make explicit. The second position, suppression, total and immediate, was held by a larger faction, and by the emperor himself. It held that the drug was destroying the country, that the destruction was the result of a failure of will rather than a failure of policy, and that what was needed was not compromise, but a man of sufficient character and authority to impose the law that already existed. This position was, in its own terms, coherent. It also required finding such a man. The emperor found him in a memorial submitted by the Governor-General of Hunan and Hubei, a document remarkable for its clarity, its directness, and its apparent immunity to the self-protective vagueness that characterized most communications traveling upward through the Qing bureaucracy. The man who wrote it proposed specific measures, named specific failures, and accepted, in the final paragraph, personal responsibility for the outcome if the emperor chose to act on his recommendations. In a system where accountability was distributed so carefully that it effectively disappeared, this was unusual enough to be striking. His name was Lin Zexu. He was 53 years old. He had never been to Canton. He had never negotiated with a British merchant. He had spent his career administering the interior of China, fighting corruption and flooding, and the ordinary catastrophes of provincial governance, and he had done it with a reputation for integrity that had survived contact with the Qing bureaucracy, which was, in itself, a kind of extraordinary achievement. In December 1838, the emperor appointed him imperial commissioner with full authority to resolve the opium crisis in Canton. The appointment came with the imperial seal, access to military forces, and instructions that left very little room for interpretation. He was to suppress the trade. Completely. Permanently. He was to make the edicts mean something. Lin Zexu accepted. He began preparations for the journey south. And somewhere in a counting house in Canton, a British merchant received word that a new commissioner was coming, and sent a letter to his colleagues in Calcutta suggesting they might want to move the next shipment slightly ahead of schedule. He arrived in Canton in March 1839, and the city knew immediately that something had changed. Not because of ceremony. Lin Zexu was not a man who used ceremony to announce himself. He arrived with staff, with documents, with the imperial seal, and with the particular quality of attention that distinguishes officials who have come to understand a situation from those who have come to be seen understanding it. Within days of his arrival, he had interviewed merchants, summoned Kohong representatives, reviewed the customs records, and cross-referenced them against the consumption estimates that the previous administration had been careful not to cross-reference against anything. The picture that emerged was not surprising. It was simply, for the first time, official. He began with the Chinese. This was deliberate. Lin Zexu understood, with the clarity of someone who had spent a career inside the Qing bureaucracy, that the trade existed because Chinese officials, Chinese merchants, and Chinese consumers had made it possible. The foreigners had supplied the commodity. China had supplied everything else. Addicts were given a period to surrender themselves for treatment. Officials found to have accepted bribes faced penalties calibrated to make the next official consider very carefully whether the arrangement was worth the risk. Several were not given the opportunity to consider it a second time. Then he turned to the foreigners. He summoned the foreign merchants through the Kohong and delivered a demand. Surrender all opium currently held aboard the receiving ships at Lintin. Provide the names of the merchants involved in the trade, and sign a bond pledging that future cargoes would contain no opium, on penalty of death under Chinese law. The demand was not a negotiating position. Lin Zexu did not present it as one. He gave them 3 days. The British Superintendent of Trade in Canton was a man named Charles Elliot. He was, by most accounts, a conscientious official, caught between a commissioner who meant exactly what he said and a foreign office in London that had not yet decided what it meant. He refused the bond. He refused the surrender of names. He did, after considerable negotiation, agree to the surrender of the opium, approximately 20,000 chests, representing the largest single seizure of the drug in history up to that point. He also, in a move that would have consequences he may not have fully calculated, pledged that the British government would compensate the merchants for their losses. That pledge was not his to make. He made it anyway. And in making it, he transformed a commercial dispute into a matter of state obligation, one that London would eventually feel compelled to honor with interest. Lin Zexu supervised the destruction of the surrendered opium personally. He had trenches dug on the beach at Human, filled with water and salt and lime, and the chests opened and their contents dissolved over a period of 23 days. He wrote a memorial to the emperor describing the process in precise detail. He also wrote, in a gesture that his contemporaries found eccentric and his historians would find remarkable, a formal address to the spirit of the sea, apologizing for the pollution and explaining that the substance being committed to the water had not been China's choice to produce. It was the kind of document that reveals a man trying to be honest, inside a situation that honesty alone cannot resolve. The British merchants watched from a distance. Some made notes. Some sent letters. The letters described the destruction in terms that ranged from outrage to something closer to reluctant admiration. Lin Zexu had done exactly what he said he would do, which was, in the experience of many who had dealt with the Qing administration, not something one could always take for granted. The admiration did not last long. Outrage was more useful. In London, the letters arrived over the following months. They described British property destroyed by a foreign government. British merchants humiliated. British commerce obstructed. The word opium appeared in some of them. It appeared less prominently than the word property. By the time the letters reached the Foreign Office and then Parliament, a certain emphasis had been established, one that would prove remarkably durable in the debates to come. Lin Zexu had done what he was sent to do. He had moved with speed and integrity through a system that had resisted both for years. He had destroyed the supply. He had threatened the network. He had, by every measure available to him, succeeded. What he had not done, could not have done, was change what was happening in London. And London, by the autumn of 1839, was beginning to have thoughts about Canton that had nothing to do with opium, and everything to do with what opium had made possible. The smell reached the surrounding villages before the news did. It was not the smell of burning. Lin Zexu had considered fire and rejected it, on the grounds that the smoke would be inhaled by workers and bystanders, and that a commissioner who poisoned the population while destroying a poison would have authored a particular kind of irony that the imperial record did not need. Instead, the trenches. Water, salt, lime, and thyme. The smell that drifted inland from Human Beach in June 1839 was something between bitter and organic, the smell of dissolution, of something that had crossed oceans and changed hands a dozen times and accumulated enormous value along the way, returning now to the basic condition of matter that cannot be sold. The operation was precise. Lin Zexu had insisted on precision the way he insisted on most things, not as a performance of authority, but as a practical matter. 500 workers operated in shifts. Each chest was opened, inspected, and its contents raked into the trenches by hand. The lime was added in measured quantities. The mixture was stirred at regular intervals to ensure complete dissolution before being released into the sea through sluice gates at low tide. Supervisors walked the length of the trenches continuously, looking for workers who might be skimming, who might be dissolving something other than opium into the water and selling what remained. Several were found. The commissioner's response to that discovery was documented and distributed to the remaining workforce before the following morning's shift. 20,241 chests. 2,400,000 pounds of opium. 23 days. Lin Zexu recorded each figure with the care of a man who understood that the record would outlast the event, that what happened at Human would be read by people who were not yet born, assessed by standards not yet established, judged from distances he could not anticipate. He wanted the record to be accurate. He wanted it to be complete. He wanted whoever read it to understand that this had been done lawfully, deliberately, and without apology. The British observers positioned themselves at a respectful distance. Some were merchants whose property was currently being dissolved in the trenches below them. Some were officials attached to Elliot's office. Some were simply curious, men who understood that they were watching something that would be significant, even if the precise nature of its significance was not yet clear. They watched in relative silence. They made notes about the scale of the operation, the organization of the workforce, the commissioner's personal presence on the beach. A few noted, without apparent irony, that it was efficiently done. Lin Zexu also wrote to Queen Victoria. The letter was composed with care and sent through the appropriate channels, though it is not entirely certain it was ever delivered or read. In it, he addressed the Queen directly, not as a supplicant, but as one sovereign to another, or as close to that as the conventions of Qing diplomatic language would allow. He noted that opium was prohibited in Britain itself. He asked, with a directness that the diplomatic correspondence of the period rarely achieved, how a nation that would not permit its own people to consume a substance could justify profiting from its sale to others. The question was reasonable. It was also, in the context of what was being prepared in London, entirely beside the point. The letter asked for a response. No response came. On the 23rd day, the last of the trenches was drained. Workers cleared the residue from the floors. The sluice gates were sealed. Lin Zexu walked the length of the beach one final time, inspecting the empty trenches with the expression, recorded by a member of his staff, of a man who has done exactly what he intended and is already thinking about what comes next. He filed his memorial to the Emperor that evening. The Emperor was pleased. The court congratulated itself, and on the receiving ships still anchored beyond Chinese territorial waters, the next consignment was already being inventoried. The trenches at Human were empty. The pipeline they had briefly interrupted was not. It had simply paused, the way water pauses at an obstacle, finding the pressure to continue, waiting for the obstruction to shift. In London, the obstruction was already being discussed. Not as a moral question, as a logistical one. The debate in the House of Commons lasted 3 days. It was, by the standards of the period, a serious debate, not a formality, not a procedure conducted for appearances, while the outcome waited in an anteroom. Men stood and argued, sometimes with considerable force, about what Britain was doing in China and what it proposed to do next. The arguments against military action were made clearly, and by people who understood what they were arguing against. William Gladstone, 30 years old, and not yet the figure history would make him, rose and asked the House to consider what flag it intended to fly in this enterprise, whether the British colours, hoisted in a canton that had been coerced into receiving a poison, would not be a permanent stain on a nation that claimed to stand for something. The speech was reported extensively. It did not change the outcome. The motion passed by 271 votes to 262. 9 votes. In a parliament of 658 members. By a margin that, had 30 men voted differently, would have produced a different century. History is not in general comfortable with this kind of arithmetic, with the suggestion that the largest empire in the world committed to a war that would reshape Asia because of 9 votes in a building on the Thames on an April evening in 1840. And yet the record is precise on the matter. 9 votes. The record does not explain what those 9 men ate for dinner, or whether they slept well, or what they told themselves in the weeks that followed. The government's position had been constructed carefully, and the construction deserves attention. The word opium was not central to it. The central argument was one of sovereignty, the right of British subjects to conduct legal commerce without interference from foreign authorities, the obligation of the Crown to protect its citizens abroad, the intolerable precedent set by allowing a Chinese official to seize and destroy British property without compensation or due process. These were not invented arguments. They were real principles, genuinely held by some of those who advanced them. They were also, in this particular context, being applied to the protection of a trade that those same principles would have condemned had it been conducted on British soil. The architecture of the argument was sound. The foundation on which it stood was something the architects preferred not to examine too closely. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston, had been corresponding with Eliot for months. His letters revealed a man who understood the opium trade clearly, who had no particular moral objection to it, and who viewed Lin Zexu's actions primarily through the lens of commercial disruption and diplomatic insult. Palmerston wanted Canton open. He wanted more ports open. He wanted a permanent British presence in China, a fixed tariff, a formal diplomatic relationship conducted between equals, or what Britain defined as equals, which was to say, on British terms. The opium was the occasion. The objective was considerably larger. The fleet was already being assembled in India when the vote was taken. 16 warships, 4 armed steamers, 27 troop transports, 4,000 soldiers. The steamers were the detail that mattered most, though no one in Beijing understood this yet. Steam-powered vessels could move against the wind and against the current, up rivers, into harbors, into positions that sailing ships and the tactical assumptions built around them could not anticipate. The Qing military had not encountered steam power in a naval context. It had not needed to. It was about to. In Canton, Lin Zexu was preparing defenses. He had requisitioned war junks, reinforced the forts along the Pearl River, hired foreign advisors to assess the coastal fortifications and suggest improvements. He worked with the same methodical intensity he had brought to the destruction of the opium, identifying the problem, assembling the resources, trusting that diligence and preparation were sufficient responses to whatever was coming. He had never seen a steam warship. He had read descriptions of them. He had not yet understood what the descriptions meant. The archive is open to everyone who finds their way here. If you're watching in the dark, wherever you are, whatever hour it is where you are, leave your location and the time in the comments. You become part of the record. That is what this place is for. The fleet left India in June 1840. It moved northeast across the South China Sea with the patience of something that has already calculated the outcome. The calculation was not arrogance. It was engineering. And the gap between what Lin Zexu was preparing for and what was actually coming toward him across that water was not a gap that diligence could close. The first engagement lasted 9 minutes. This is not a figure chosen for effect. It appears in the logs of the British vessels present, recorded with the same administrative neutrality used to note weather conditions and provisions consumed. 9 minutes from first contact to the effective destruction of the Chinese naval force at the Battle of Chuanbi in January 1841. The war junks that Lin Zexu had requisitioned and reinforced and positioned with considerable tactical thought were, in the specific context of steam-powered warships armed with exploding shells, not warships. They were large wooden objects in water. The distinction became clear almost immediately. The technological gap between the two forces was not, in 1840, a recent development. Britain had been industrializing for the better part of a century. Its metallurgy, its engineering, its capacity to project organized violence across oceanic distances had been advancing through a series of incremental improvements that, taken individually, seemed modest, and taken together, had produced something without precedent in the history of warfare. The Congreve rocket, the carronade, the iron-hulled steamer. Each innovation had been tested in other theaters: India, the Americas, the Napoleonic Wars, refined through use, incorporated into doctrine. By the time the fleet arrived off the Chinese coast, British naval warfare had been through 40 years of continuous development that the Qing military, isolated by policy and geography, had not observed and could not have replicated quickly, even if it had. The Qing forces were not cowards. This matters, and the record is clear on it. At several engagements along the coast and up the river systems, Chinese soldiers and sailors fought with considerable determination against forces they could not match, and odds they understood were impossible. At the Bogue forts guarding the Pearl River approach to Canton, the garrison held its position under bombardment until the position no longer existed. At Zhenhai, the defender, an elderly general named Yi Yunfei, reportedly refused to retreat when retreat was still possible and died at his post when it was not. These facts appear in British dispatches, sometimes with the particular admiration that soldiers extend to enemies who behave as soldiers. They did not change the outcome of any engagement. The steamers were the decisive element. The Nemesis, an iron-hulled, shallow-draft steamer that could navigate the Pearl River's upper reaches, became something close to a symbol of the campaign, though symbol is perhaps too aesthetic a word for a vessel whose primary contribution was the destruction of war junks at a rate that contemporaries found difficult to describe without resorting to the language of the mechanical rather than the martial. It moved where it chose to move. It fired when it chose to fire. The wind was irrelevant to it. The current was irrelevant to it. The tactical assumptions that had governed Chinese naval warfare for centuries were irrelevant to it. The Nemesis did not know this, being a ship. Its crew did. In Beijing, the reports arrived with the characteristic delay of a bureaucratic system transmitting bad news upward through channels designed for the transmission of good news. The first accounts were optimistic, or rather, they were written by men who understood that pessimism, in the Qing administrative context, was a career choice with significant consequences. Defeats were described as tactical repositioning. Losses were softened by qualifications. The emperor read documents that bore a diminishing relationship to events as they were actually unfolding on the coast. By the time accurate information reached him, the situation it described had already deteriorated further. Lin Zexu was removed from his post in September 1840. The emperor, under pressure from factions at court who had opposed the confrontation from the beginning and now had evidence to support their position, needed someone to blame for the military reverses. Lin Zexu was the obvious choice. He had been sent to resolve the crisis. The crisis had not been resolved. The logic was impeccable, if one did not examine it too carefully. He was stripped of his rank, exiled to the northwestern frontier, and replaced by officials whose primary qualification was their willingness to negotiate. He accepted the punishment without public complaint. He wrote in his diary, during the journey into exile, that he understood why it had happened. He did not write that it was just. He also wrote, and this entry is dated 3 years before the Second Opium War, before Hong Kong, before the Treaty of Nanking had fully revealed what it contained, that China's fundamental problem was not the British, and not the opium, and not even the 9 votes in Parliament. It was the cannons. China needed to understand the cannons. It needed to build the ships. It needed to close the gap. He wrote this from a cart moving northwest into the desert. It would take China the better part of a century to begin to act on the observation. By then, the gap had grown considerably wider. The document was 29 pages long, written in English and Chinese, and it changed the shape of Asia. The Treaty of Nanking was signed on the 29th of August 1842, aboard a British warship anchored in the Yangtze River, a location chosen not for convenience but for clarity. The message encoded in the setting was not subtle, and it was not meant to be. The Qing representatives arrived by boat, climbed aboard, and signed in a cabin that smelled of gunpowder and river water, surrounded by men in uniforms that had, over the preceding 2 years, demonstrated their practical meaning with considerable thoroughness. The signing took less than an hour. The reading, in any complete sense, would take considerably longer. The Dynasty's negotiators were not, in the main, men who read English. This was not an oversight on Britain's part. The Chinese text of the treaty had been prepared by translators working under significant time pressure, in conditions that did not encourage the kind of careful cross-referencing that a document of this consequence demanded. Several of the treaty's key terms, extraterritoriality, most favored nation status, the mechanisms by which tariffs would be set, existed in the Chinese text in formulations that approximated the English meaning, without fully capturing its legal implications. The approximations would matter enormously in the years that followed. They were not corrected. What China surrendered was specific and large. Hong Kong Island, ceded in perpetuity to the British Crown. 5 treaty ports, Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, Shanghai, open to British trade and residence, with Britain retaining the right to set the terms of engagement in each. A fixed tariff of 5% on imports negotiated by Britain, applicable regardless of what China thought it needed to protect. 21 million silver dollars in indemnity, covering the cost of the destroyed opium, the expenses of the military campaign, and debts owed to British merchants by the Kohong firms that had been, under the Canton system, China's designated intermediaries with the foreign world. The Kohong itself was abolished. The Canton system, the gate, the controlled aperture through which China had managed its encounter with the outside world for over a century, ceased to exist. The treaty did not mention opium. This was not an accident. The British negotiators understood that including opium explicitly would require them to address, in a legal document, the precise nature of what they had gone to war to protect. The omission was cleaner. The trade continued regardless, informally at first, then with increasing openness, then legally. After the Second Opium War, a decade later formalized what the first had made practically inevitable. The treaty that ended the Opium War did not legalize opium. It simply created the conditions under which legalization became, for China, the path of least resistance. The indemnity was the provision that carried the most immediate weight. 21 million silver dollars. Paid in installments, with interest on late payments, drawn from a treasury that was already strained by the costs of the war and the decade of silver drain that had preceded it. China would spend the next several years extracting the indemnity from its own population through increased taxation, which is to say, the people least responsible for the decisions that had produced the war bore the largest share of its financial consequences. This is not a feature unique to this particular treaty. It is a feature of how empires manage defeat. It is noted here because the record should be complete. In Beijing, the emperor received the terms. He approved them because the alternative, continuing a war that the previous 2 years had demonstrated could not be won with available resources, was not, in any realistic sense, an alternative. He described the treaty in communications to his court, using language that reframed concession as magnanimity. The emperor, in his benevolence, had chosen to end hostilities and restore order. The language was not believed by everyone who read it. It was used by everyone who repeated it. The distance between private understanding and official language was, in the Qing court of 1842, a distance that several people were working very hard to maintain. The British celebrated with the particular restraint of people who have received more than they publicly asked for. Palmerston, reviewing the terms from London, expressed dissatisfaction. He had wanted more ports, a clearer diplomatic framework, more explicit guarantees. The men who had negotiated the treaty on the ground considered this response ungrateful. Palmerston considered it realistic. He was, on the available evidence, correct. What had been extracted from China in 1842 was significant. What could be extracted, given sufficient pressure and sufficient time, was considerably more. The Treaty of Nanking was not, in Palmerston's reading of it, a conclusion. It was a beginning. The Qing representatives returned to shore by the same boats that had brought them. The warship remained at anchor for 2 more days before moving downriver. On the dock at Nanking, a clerk recorded the departure in the harbour log with the same handwriting he used for everything else. Arrivals and departures. Cargo manifests. The ordinary administration of a port city on a river that had just witnessed something that would take a generation to fully understand. He stamped the page. He moved to the next entry. The river continued as rivers do, indifferent, unhurried, carrying everything downstream. Lord Palmerston called it a barren island with hardly a house upon it. The phrase appeared in a private letter, written in the weeks after the cession was confirmed, and it was not intended as geography. It was intended as criticism, directed at Charles Elliot, who had negotiated the acquisition of Hong Kong Island in place of the commercial concessions and formal diplomatic access that Palmerston had wanted and considered considerably more valuable. Elliot was recalled shortly afterward, his career effectively concluded by the judgment that he had obtained the wrong things from a war that had been fought at considerable expense to obtain the right ones. He spent the rest of his professional life in minor postings. The island he had acquired became one of the most significant ports in the world. These two facts coexisted without either cancelling the other. Hong Kong in 1842 was, by the standards Palmerston was applying, genuinely unpromising. A granite outcrop rising steeply from the Pearl River estuary. Approximately 30 square miles of mountainous terrain with a sheltered deep-water harbour on its northern shore, and a population of perhaps 4,000, fisherfolk, farmers, and the inhabitants of several small villages, who had not been consulted about the arrangements being made regarding their home. The harbour was excellent. The rest required work. The British administrators who arrived in the months following cession found a place that was simultaneously strategically invaluable and practically inconvenient, and set about resolving the inconvenience with the systematic energy of an empire that had considerable practice converting inconvenient places into useful ones. The transformation was rapid in the way that transformations are rapid when they are backed by capital and do not require the consent of those being transformed. Within a year, the northern shore of the island, what would become Victoria, had been surveyed, plotted, and divided into lots that were auctioned to merchants, many of whom had recently had their warehoused opium dissolved in trenches at Human, and now found themselves, through the mechanisms of indemnity and treaty, in a position to rebuild their operations on considerably more secure legal footing. The irony of this particular reconstruction was noted by almost no one at the time. The merchants were busy. The administrators were busy. The 4,000 people who had been living on the island before the flag was raised were adjusting, in the ways that people adjust when the larger forces arranging the world around them move faster than any individual response can track. The Qing court's reaction to the loss of Hong Kong was complex in ways that the official record does not fully capture. Privately, several senior officials understood that ceding sovereign territory, however small, however rocky, however peripheral to the empire's actual concerns, established a precedent whose implications extended well beyond the island itself. A dynasty that would surrender territory under military pressure could be pressured again. The logic was clear, and the men who understood it said so in memorials and private correspondence that circulated within the court with the careful discretion of documents whose authors understood they were describing something the emperor did not want described. The emperor's position, publicly, was that Hong Kong was of negligible value, and its cession, therefore, no cause for concern. This position was maintained with considerable consistency for a man who also issued, in the same period, several edicts expressing concern about it. The 5 treaty ports opened in the months following Nanking, with varying degrees of resistance from local populations and local officials who had not been party to the negotiations and did not consider themselves bound by their outcomes in any spirit beyond the technical. Shanghai, which would become the most consequential of the 5, was at this point a mid-sized trading city on the Yangtze Delta, significant within China's internal commercial geography, largely unknown outside it. British merchants arrived, established a settlement on the mudflats north of the old city, and began the process of making themselves permanent in the specific way that commercial interests make themselves permanent, through infrastructure, through legal frameworks, through the accumulation of facts on the ground that subsequent negotiations would have to account for. Within a decade, Shanghai's foreign settlement would be larger than most British colonial cities. Within 2 decades, it would be unrecognizable to anyone who had known it before the treaty. The barren island, meanwhile, was filling in. Ships arrived with building materials, with administrators, with the families of merchants who had decided that the situation was stable enough to bring families. The harbour handled increasing tonnage each quarter. The lots on the northern shore appreciated in value at a rate that made Palmerston's original assessment look less like criticism and more like a failure of imagination. He did not revise the assessment publicly. He did not need to. The island was revising it on his behalf, one ship at a time, one auction at a time, one warehouse built on granite that had belonged to fishermen who no longer had a word for what had happened to them. In the villages on the island's southern shore, life continued in forms that the new administration on the northern coast was not yet paying close attention to. The fisherfolk went out in the mornings as they always had. The farmers worked the thin soil of the hillside terraces. The temples remained open. The rhythms of the place, the tides, the seasonal winds, the particular quality of light over the harbor at dusk had not changed. Everything else was changing around them with a speed that the rhythms could not accommodate, and the people living inside them had not chosen. This is how most history arrives for most people. Not as a decision, not as a debate, not as a vote in a building on the Thames, as weather. As something that was already happening before anyone thought to ask whether it should. The others arrived with the same documents. Not identical, the language varied, the specific demands differed in their particulars. The names of the ports and the sizes of the indemnities and the precise formulations of the commercial guarantees were each calibrated to the negotiating position of the power presenting them. But the architecture was consistent. A treaty signed under circumstances that made refusal equivalent to resumed hostilities, granting access to Chinese markets, extraterritorial jurisdiction over the presenting power's citizens, and most favored nation status, meaning that whatever concession China made to any one power would automatically extend to all the others. The clause was elegant in its efficiency. It meant that China, in negotiating with anyone, was negotiating with everyone simultaneously, without any of the others being present or accountable for the pressure being applied. The United States arrived first, in 1844. The American negotiator, Caleb Cushing, had watched the outcome of the First Opium War with considerable attention, and arrived in China with instructions to obtain, through diplomacy, what Britain had obtained through force, and to obtain it before the situation stabilized in ways that might make the obtaining more difficult. He was received by Qing officials who understood, by this point, that the category of foreign power demanding treaties had expanded beyond Britain and would likely continue to expand, and who were developing, of necessity, a certain bureaucratic fluency in the processing of humiliations. The Treaty of Wangxia was signed in July 1844. It gave the United States most of what Britain had: extraterritoriality, fixed tariffs, open ports, without the expense of a war. Cushing considered this a diplomatic achievement. It was, from a certain angle, exactly that. France followed within months. The French treaty added a provision that the others had not included: the right to propagate Catholicism throughout China, including in the interior, beyond the treaty ports. The provision had been requested by French missionaries who had been operating in China, with varying degrees of official tolerance, for 2 centuries. The Qing negotiators accepted it with the exhausted pragmatism of men who had recently accepted the loss of Hong Kong and the opening of 5 ports and $21 million in indemnity, and for whom one more concession had lost the capacity to feel qualitatively different from the others. The provision would, in subsequent decades, produce conflicts between Chinese communities and Christian missionaries that the treaty's authors had not modeled and its signatories had not anticipated. This is the nature of provisions negotiated under duress. They create obligations whose consequences extend well beyond the moment of signing, into futures that no one at the table was required to inhabit. Russia had been watching from the north. The Russian approach to China was different in geography and similar in outcome: a long border rather than a coastline, pressure applied through proximity rather than naval power, concessions extracted through the implicit threat of a frontier that could be made more or less stable depending on the quality of the relationship between Beijing and St. Petersburg. The Treaty of Kulja in 1851, the Treaty of Peking in 1860. Russia accumulated territory and trading rights through a series of agreements that the Qing courts signed with the same combination of necessity and diminishing resistance that characterized all its treaty-making in this period. Russia was, in this sense, the most patient of the powers, acquiring through adjacency what others acquired through expeditions, at a fraction of the cost and with considerably less noise. The most favored nation clauses meant that China could not, even in principle, play the powers against each other. Any concession made to one automatically became a concession made to all. Any attempt to offer one power preferential terms in exchange for support against another would immediately, by treaty obligation, extend those preferential terms to the power China had been attempting to balance against. The architecture of the treaty system had, whether by design or by the accumulated logic of its individual components, produced a structure from which diplomatic maneuver was essentially impossible. China could not negotiate its way out. It could not play for time in the conventional sense. It could comply or it could resist, and resistance, as 1842 had demonstrated, produced outcomes that the treaty system, for all its inequities, was preferable to. In the Qing court, a phrase began to circulate among officials attempting to think about what had happened and what might be done about it. The phrase was self-strengthening, Zhiqiang, and it described a project of modernization, of acquiring the technical capacities that the gap at Chuanbi had revealed as absent. The project was real, and it produced real results over the following decades: arsenals, shipyards, telegraph lines, the beginnings of a modern military. It was also conducted within a political structure that resisted, at its core, the kinds of institutional change that technological modernization tends to require. The dynasty wanted the cannons without the conditions that had produced the cannons. This turned out to be difficult to arrange. The queue of powers presenting documents continued. Each arrival was, in its own framing, reasonable. Each came with language about commerce and civilization, and the mutual benefits of open exchange. Each left with something that had belonged to China before the meeting began. The Qing officials who processed these arrivals developed, over time, a particular expression that foreign diplomats noted in their dispatches, without quite finding the word for, something between resignation and a very precise, very private fury that the circumstances did not yet permit them to express in any form the other party would be required to acknowledge. The fury was being stored carefully in a place the treaties could not reach. The powers presenting their documents did not consider this relevant information. They had what they had come for. They moved on to the next negotiation, the next port, the next clause requiring China's signature on something China had not written and would not, under other circumstances, have signed. The ship was called the Arrow, and it was not, at the moment that mattered, flying a British flag. This is not a minor detail. The Arrow was a launcher, a hybrid vessel, Chinese-built with Western rigging, registered in Hong Kong under a British license that had expired 12 days before the incident that would use it as justification for a war. On the 8th of October 1856, Chinese authorities in Canton boarded the Arrow, arrested 12 of its Chinese crew members on suspicion of piracy, and in the process, according to the British consul Harry Parkes, who was not present, lowered or otherwise dishonored the British flag. Whether the flag was actually flying at the time remains, in the historical record, genuinely uncertain. The Chinese authorities maintained it was not. Parkes maintained it was. The license had expired regardless. None of these facts prevented what followed. Parkes demanded an apology, the return of the arrested men, and a written guarantee of future respect for British vessels. The Chinese authorities returned the men, without the written apology, which Parkes rejected as insufficient. The British superintendent ordered the Navy to bombard the Canton forts. The forts were bombarded. Canton was partially occupied. And a second war, larger and more destructive than the first, began over a flag that may not have been flying on a ship whose British registration had already lapsed. In London, the news produced a parliamentary crisis. Richard Cobden, the free trade advocate, who had spent his career arguing that commerce was inherently pacifying, rose in the Commons and moved that the government's actions in Canton were contrary to international law and unsupported by the evidence. The motion passed. The government lost the vote. Palmerston, now Prime Minister, dissolved Parliament and called an election on essentially a single issue: whether Britain had been right to act in China. The electorate offered a choice between the men who said Britain had been wrong and the man who said Britain was always right when it came to protecting British interests abroad, returned Palmerston with an increased majority. Cobden lost his seat. The war continued. France joined, this time as a formal co-belligerent. The French justification was the execution of a French missionary named Auguste Chapdelaine in Guangxi province earlier that year, a genuine atrocity conducted by local officials in violation of the treaty provisions protecting Christian missionaries that France had negotiated in 1844. The execution was real. The French outrage was real. The timing, arriving precisely as Britain needed a co-belligerent to expand the scope of military operations, was convenient enough that several contemporaries noted it, and several historians have noted it since. France and Britain were not, in 1856, natural allies in most respects. In this particular respect, their interests aligned with the frictionless ease of parties who want the same thing and have found different reasons to want it. The combined force was considerably larger than what Britain had deployed in the First Opium War. 17,000 troops, a naval squadron that had incorporated the lessons of the first campaign and improved on them, and a diplomatic objective that went well beyond what the Treaty of Nanking had produced. The British wanted more ports, access to the interior, legalization of the opium trade, a permanent ambassador in Beijing, not at the border, not through intermediaries, but in the capital, in a building that the Qing Emperor would be required to acknowledge as the seat of a foreign power operating on equal terms within his own city. That last demand was, in the context of the Qing worldview, the most radical of all. An ambassador in Beijing was not a commercial arrangement. It was a statement about what China was, not the center of the world receiving tribute, but one state among others, subject to the same diplomatic conventions, the same international law, the same system of relations that Europe had developed for itself and was now extending, at gunpoint, to everyone else. The Qing court understood this perfectly. It resisted the ambassador demand longer and more consistently than almost any other provision in the subsequent negotiations. It was, in the end, the provision that cost the most to refuse. When the Allied forces moved north in 1860, bypassing Canton and advancing directly toward Beijing, the court's resistance to the ambassador became, in the brutal arithmetic of military occupation, a position it could no longer afford to hold. The emperor left Beijing in August 1860 as the Allied forces approached. He went north to the imperial hunting lodge at Chengde, accompanied by the court, the imperial seals, and the careful fiction, that this was a hunting expedition rather than a flight. He would not return. He died at Chengde the following year, leaving the throne to a 5-year-old son and the management of the dynasty's Humiliation to a regency council that would be dominated, within months, by a woman whose name the treaties had not anticipated, and whose influence over the next half-century of Chinese history no ambassador's residence in Beijing would be able to contain. Behind him, in the capital, the Allied commanders were making a decision about a building. The old summer palace had taken 150 years to build. It was not a single structure, but a complex. 350 interconnected gardens, pavilions, lakes and courtyards spread across 3.5 square kilometers north of Beijing, constructed and expanded by successive Qing emperors as both residence and statement. Emperors had governed from it, received ambassadors in it, written poetry in it, died in it. The Jesuits who had served at the Qing court in the 18th century had contributed designs for a section of European-style Baroque fountains and facades, an incongruity that the emperors had found interesting rather than threatening, the confidence of a civilization that could incorporate the foreign without being altered by it. By 1860, those fountains had been playing for 100 years. The gardens had reached the particular fullness that only time produces. The libraries contained manuscripts that existed nowhere else. The Allied forces reached the palace complex in early October 1860. What they found there had already been partially disturbed. Advance units had moved through several of the outer pavilions in the preceding days, and the process of disturbance had proceeded with the organic efficiency of armies encountering portable wealth in the absence of clear orders about what to do with it. Soldiers took what they could carry. Officers took what officers take, which tends to be more considered and more valuable. The formal looting, it was called prize distribution in the documents, was conducted over several days, with a portion of the proceeds auctioned and the revenue distributed among the troops according to rank. Lord Elgin, the British High Commissioner, observed the process with the expression of a man who disapproves of chaos and is taking steps to ensure it is conducted in an orderly fashion. The decision to burn the palace was Elgin's, and he made it deliberately. His stated justification was the treatment of a British diplomatic mission that had been captured during negotiations and held at the palace. Several of the prisoners had died in custody, some under conditions that the subsequent investigation described with careful understatement as severe. Elgin argued that burning the palace was a proportionate response directed specifically at the emperor, whose residence it was, rather than at the Chinese population generally. That it communicated, in terms the Qing court could not misread, the consequences of violating the conventions of diplomatic immunity. The argument had internal logic. It was also, in the view of several of his own officers, and at least one member of his staff, who recorded his objections in writing, a rationalization for an act whose actual purpose was to demonstrate, in the most visible terms available, that nothing in China was beyond the reach of what had come to enforce the treaties. The fires were lit on the 18th of October, 1860. They burned for 2 days. The smoke was visible from Beijing, 20 kilometers to the south, a column rising over the plain that the population of the capital could see from the city walls, and that the members of the Regency Council, managing the emperor's affairs in his absence, could not avoid looking at. The heat was intense enough that soldiers tasked with maintaining the perimeter reported being unable to approach certain sections of the complex. The libraries burned. The manuscripts burned. The Baroque fountains that the Jesuits had designed survived in partial form, stone and bronze resisting what wood and paper could not. and stand today as the site's most photographed remnant, which is its own kind of irony, the foreign contribution outlasting the thing it had been installed to complement. A French officer named Charles Cousin Montauban watched the fires from a distance and wrote in his journal that the sight was magnificent. He was not, by the accounts of those who knew him, a cruel man. He was a soldier who had been given an objective and had achieved it, watching the evidence of achievement produce a visual effect that the aesthetic vocabulary available to him could only describe as magnificent. The word is in the journal. It has remained there. History tends to preserve exactly the details that illuminate the thing most precisely, and that the people who created them would most prefer to have used different words for. Elgin wrote to London that the action had been painful but necessary. The word painful appears twice in the letter. The word necessary appears 3 times. He noted that the emperor would understand the message. He was correct in this assessment. The emperor, at Chengde, received reports of the fire and is recorded as having been. The Chinese text uses a word that translates approximately as devastated, though devastated does not fully carry the weight of what it means to lose, in 2 days, something that took 150 years to build, and that represented, in a way that palaces represent these things, the idea that the dynasty inhabiting it was permanent. The Convention of Peking was signed 3 weeks later. China ceded the southern tip of the Kowloon Peninsula, opened more ports, granted freedom of movement to Christian missionaries throughout the interior, agreed to the legalization of the opium trade, and consented to the establishment of a permanent British legation in Beijing, the ambassador's residence that the court had resisted longer than anything else, now obtained in the shadow of smoke that had not yet fully cleared from the northern horizon. The fountains continued to run for several more years before the water supply was disrupted, and they fell silent. The stone figures that had surrounded them, 12 animals of the Chinese zodiac, cast in bronze, serving as waterspouts around the central pool, were eventually scattered. Some were sold, some lost, some acquired by collectors whose descendants would, a century and a half later, find themselves in complicated conversations with institutions representing a country that had not forgotten where the figures had come from and had developed, in the intervening time, considerable capacity to make that fact inconvenient for the people currently holding them. The smoke had cleared by then. The memory had not. The Emperor Xianfeng died at Chengde on the 22nd of August, 1861. He was 30 years old. He had been emperor for 11 years, during which time China had fought 2 wars it could not win, signed treaties it could not refuse, lost territory it could not recover, and watched the administrative architecture of a dynasty that had governed a quarter of the world's population begin, in ways that were measurable and accelerating, to come apart at its foundations. He died of what the court physicians recorded as illness, the specific nature of which the historical record has debated, with varying degrees of delicacy, ever since. He left behind a 5-year-old son, a court divided between factions that had been accumulating grievances against each other for years, and a dynasty that had just, in the space of 2 decades, been demonstrated to be something other than what it had always believed itself to be. What happened next was not in any treaty. The emperor had designated 8 senior officials as regents for his young son, men chosen for their loyalty to the throne and their seniority within the existing order, which is to say, men chosen for the qualities that had produced the preceding 20 years. Within weeks of the emperor's death, 2 of his consorts, Empress Dowager Qia and, more consequentially, Empress Dowager Shixi, the mother of the new emperor, allied with the late emperor's brother, Prince Gong, and executed a coup against the Regency Council with a speed and completeness that suggested it had been planned considerably in advance of the emperor's death. 3 of the 8 regents were executed. The others were removed from their positions. The coup was given a name, the Xinyu coup, and a justification, and within the month it had been incorporated into the official record as a necessary correction rather than a seizure of power. Cixi was 25 years old. She had entered the imperial court as a low-ranking concubine at 16, born the emperor's only surviving son at 22, and spent the intervening years developing in an environment where direct power was structurally unavailable to women, an extraordinary fluency in the indirect forms that power takes when it cannot be held openly. She read documents. She understood policy. She cultivated relationships with officials whose positions gave them access to information and decisions that she was not formally entitled to influence. By the time the emperor died, she understood the machinery of the Qing state better than most of the men who were officially operating it. This understanding would sustain her influence over Chinese governance for the next 47 years, through 2 more emperors, 3 more wars, a rebellion that killed more people than the American Civil War, and a reform movement that she would initially encourage and then, with a decisiveness that her critics found brutal and her defenders found necessary, destroy. The court returned to Beijing in the autumn of 1861. It returned to a city that contained now a permanent British legation in the Dongjiaoan Lane Quarter, a building flying a foreign flag within the imperial capital, staffed by diplomats who were not required to perform the kowtow, who communicated with the throne as equals, who represented the culmination of everything the Qing worldview had been constructed to prevent. The court processed this fact with the institutional discipline of a structure that had survived by converting catastrophe into procedure. The legation was acknowledged. Its staff were received through the appropriate channels. The kowtow question was resolved through a protocol compromise that allowed both sides to describe the outcome as satisfactory. The dynasty continued. What the dynasty could not convert into procedure was the internal damage. The Taiping Rebellion, which had begun in 1850 and would not end until 1864, had by this point killed somewhere between 20 and 30 million people. The estimates vary because counting the dead of a civil war of that scale requires a bureaucratic capacity that the war itself destroys. The rebellion had begun as a millenarian religious movement, led by a man who believed himself to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ, and had grown into a state, the heavenly kingdom of great peace, that controlled significant portions of southern China, including the city of Nanjing, for over a decade. The Qing forces had been unable to suppress it alone. They had required, in the end, assistance from foreign-led armies, the ever-victorious army, commanded by Western officers, deploying Western tactics and Western weapons in defense of a dynasty that those same Western powers had been systematically weakening through the treaty system for 20 years. The irony was structural. The dynasty needed its adversaries to survive its own subjects. Everyone involved understood this. No one said it plainly. The self-strengthening movement gained momentum in this period, driven by officials like Zheng Guofan and Li Hongjiang, who had led the suppression of the Taiping and emerged from the experience with a very clear understanding of what China lacked and what acquiring it would require. Arsenals were built at Shanghai and Nanjing. Shipyards were established. Students were sent abroad, to the United States, to Europe, to study the technical disciplines that the gap at Xuanbi had identified as absent. The first group of Chinese students arrived in the United States in 1872, boys between the ages of 10 and 16, carrying with them the specific weight of being sent to learn from the civilization that had most recently demonstrated the cost of not knowing what they were being sent to learn. Cixi observed all of this from the position she had constructed for herself, regent, then advisor, then the gravitational center around which the court organized itself regardless of who nominally held power. She was not, in this period, opposed to modernization in principle. She supported the arsenals, the shipyards, the diplomatic missions. What she opposed, with a consistency that her critics described as reactionary and her defenders described as prudent, was the kind of institutional reform that would have altered the structure of power within which she operated. Modernize the weapons, yes. Modernize the examination system, the civil administration, the relationship between the throne and the governed. This was a different question, one whose answer threatened not the dynasty in the abstract, but the specific arrangements that kept specific people in the positions they currently occupied. The self-strengthening movement would acquire better guns. It would not acquire the institutional conditions that made better guns sustainable. Outside the legation quarter, Beijing continued, as Beijing had continued through everything, the markets, the temples, the examination halls, where young men still memorized classical texts in the hope of passing tests designed for a world that was, outside those halls, no longer the world they would be required to inhabit. The smoke from the old summer palace had long since dispersed. The ruins were visible on clear days from the northern roads out of the city. People passed them. Most did not stop. There was nothing to stop for, and the road ahead required attention, and the ruins were already doing what ruins do, becoming permanent, becoming part of the landscape, becoming the kind of thing that is always there and therefore almost never seen. The opium was legal now. The Convention of Peking in 1860 had formalized what the preceding 2 decades had made practically inevitable. The trade that had begun in the holds of unmarked ships, that had been processed through receiving vessels anchored outside territorial waters, that had moved through delta channels at night in boats whose names appeared in no official register, was now conducted in the open, taxed, recorded, and protected by the same treaty framework that governed silk and cotton and tea. The customs receipts were filed. The manifests were accurate. The word opium appeared in the ledgers in the same typeface as every other commodity. The system that Lin Zexu had destroyed 20,000 chests of had not been defeated. It had been promoted. The market expanded accordingly. By the 1870s, China was importing approximately 80,000 chests of opium per year, 4 times the volume that had existed at the height of the illegal trade in the years before Human. The revenue it generated was substantial enough that both the British Indian government, which taxed the export, and the Qing government, which taxed the import, had developed significant fiscal dependencies on its continuation. This created a situation of some diplomatic delicacy. China was, by this period, making periodic formal requests that Britain consider reducing or ending the trade, on the grounds that it was destroying the population and draining the treasury. Britain's response, consistently and across multiple administrations, was that the trade was legal, that the demand was Chinese, and that restricting supply would merely shift consumption to domestically produced opium, which China had begun cultivating in significant quantities in provinces like Yunnan and Sichuan, precisely because the imported supply was insufficient to meet the demand the imported supply had created. The argument was not without logic. It was also the argument of a system describing its own perpetuation as an inevitability. The domestic cultivation was, in its own way, a more complete form of destruction than the import had been. When opium arrived from India, the silver at least moved, outward, painfully, but in a direction that was visible and measurable, and that produced, in its visibility, the kind of alarm that motivates response. Domestic cultivation kept the money within China's borders, which meant the economic signal was quieter, which meant the scale of consumption could grow further before the damage became impossible to ignore, in the ways that damage needs to become impossible to ignore before institutions act on it. By 1900, China was producing more opium domestically than it was importing. The producing provinces had restructured their agricultural economies around the crop in ways that made transition to alternative cultivation economically ruinous for individual farmers. The same trap the East India Company had constructed in Bihar, replicated now across the interior of China by Chinese farmers responding to Chinese market signals in a situation the original import had created and the legalization had accelerated. The treaty ports, meanwhile, had become something that no one in 1842 had fully anticipated. Shanghai by the 1880s was a city of extraordinary complexity. The foreign settlements on the northern bank of the Suzhou Creek, operating under their own governance, their own police, their own courts, exempt from Chinese law, physically adjacent to but legally separate from the Chinese city to the south. The international settlement and the French concession had developed their own newspapers, their own infrastructure, their own social hierarchies that intersected with the surrounding Chinese city at specific points and maintained careful separation at others. Chinese entrepreneurs operated within the settlements because the legal protections they offered were more reliable than those available in the Chinese-administered portions of the city. Chinese workers lived in the settlements because the wages were higher and the physical infrastructure more maintained. The settlements were, in their daily functioning, deeply entangled with the city around them, and, in their legal structure, entirely insulated from it. This combination, entanglement without accountability, produced a Shanghai that was simultaneously the most dynamic commercial city in Asia and a demonstration, visible from any street corner, of what sovereignty looked like when it had been comprehensively qualified. The Qing court watched all of this with the particular helplessness of an institution that understands its situation clearly and lacks the capacity to change it through the means available to it. The self-strengthening arsenals were producing ships and guns. The Beiyang Fleet, China's modern northern navy, built over 20 years at enormous expense, was, by the early 1890s, one of the largest in Asia on paper. In 1894, it encountered the Japanese Navy at the Battle of the Yalu River and was effectively destroyed in a single afternoon. Japan, which had begun its own modernization in 1868 with the Meiji Restoration, had spent those 26 years changing not just its weapons, but its institutions, its legal system, its educational structure, its relationship between state and industry, the entire organizational substrate on which military capacity actually rests. China had built the fleet. Japan had built the conditions that make fleets effective. The difference at the Yalu River was visible within hours. The defeat by Japan was, in some ways, more psychologically devastating than the defeats by Britain had been. Britain was distant, technologically incomprehensible, the product of an industrial revolution that China had not witnessed developing, and therefore could not easily have anticipated. Japan was a neighbor, a civilization that had for centuries looked to China as a cultural source, a country that had been, within living memory, considered less advanced than China in almost every respect that the Qing worldview used to measure advancement. That Japan, small, recently transformed, a student that had overtaken its teacher, could destroy a Chinese fleet that had taken 20 years, and the equivalent of hundreds of millions of modern dollars to build, was a demonstration of something that the self-strengthening movement had been carefully not demonstrating for 20 years. The weapons were not the point. The weapons had never been the point. Lin Zexu had understood this from a cart moving northwest into the desert in 1840. It had taken 54 years and a naval battle in the Yellow Sea for the understanding to become impossible to avoid. In the treaty ports, the evening papers reported the battle results, with the particular detachment of publications operating under foreign jurisdiction in a country that had just lost its navy. The stock prices in the international settlement adjusted accordingly. The clubs along the Bund continued their regular schedules. The river traffic on the Huangpu moved as it always moved, dense, purposeful, indifferent to the larger calculations being revised, in offices and palaces and village tea houses across China, about what the country was and what it was going to have to become. There is a phrase in Chinese that does not translate cleanly. 百年国耻. 100 years of national humiliation. The translation loses something in the crossing. Humiliation in English carries the weight of a moment, an incident, a specific occasion of shame that passes and is remembered. Guoche is different. It is structural. It describes not an event but a condition, a state of affairs in which the nation itself has been diminished, in which the diminishment is ongoing, in which the recovery of what was lost is not nostalgia but obligation. The phrase entered Chinese political language in the years after the Yalu River, when the accumulation of defeats had become too large and too consistent to be explained by individual failures of individuals, and required instead a framework that could hold the entire weight of what had happened since that first ship moved into the Pearl River estuary, with cotton and wool and lead on its manifest, and something else in its holds. The 100 Days Reform of 1898 was the most serious attempt the Qing dynasty made to change itself from within. The young emperor Guangxu, 27 years old and operating in the permanent shadow of Shixi's regency, issued a series of edicts over 103 days that proposed transforming the examination system, modernizing the military, reforming the bureaucracy, establishing a constitutional framework, creating a modern educational system, the institutional changes that the self-strengthening movement had built weapons around, but never reached. The reformers around him, Kang Yuwei, Liang Qichao, had studied what Japan had done with the Meiji Restoration, and concluded that China's problem was not capability but structure, not intelligence but institution, not the people but the system within which the people were required to operate. They were correct. They were also operating within a court that contained Cixi, who understood exactly what the reforms would mean for the arrangements that sustained her position. After 103 days, Cixi moved. The emperor was placed under house arrest on an island in the imperial lake. He would remain there, effectively a prisoner, for the remaining 10 years of his life. 6 of the leading reformers were executed. Kang Yuwei and Liang Qichao escaped into exile, where they would spend the next decades writing, organizing, and arguing about what China needed to become, doing from the outside what they had briefly, almost, managed to begin from the inside. The reform edicts were rescinded. The examination system continued. The classical texts remained the curriculum. The institutional architecture of the Qing state was restored to the configuration it had occupied before the 100 Days, as though the 100 Days had been a fever that had broken and left the patient unchanged. 2 years later, the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxers, the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, were a movement that had emerged from the rural interior, from the provinces where the treaty port economy had disrupted traditional livelihoods, where Christian missionaries operating under the protections France had negotiated in 1844 had produced communities with divided loyalties and complicated relationships to their neighbors, where the accumulated pressure of 60 years of foreign penetration had found, in the absence of institutional outlets, the only form available to it. They believed, or said they believed, that ritual practice made them immune to foreign bullets. They moved toward Beijing in the summer of 1900, killing Chinese Christians and foreign missionaries along the way, and Cixi, in a decision that her defenders have struggled to explain as anything other than catastrophic miscalculation, issued a declaration of war against all foreign powers simultaneously. 8 nations responded: Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, the United States, Italy, Austria-Hungary. An alliance assembled with a speed that reflected the degree to which the foreign powers had been waiting, with varying degrees of patience, for an occasion that would justify the next round of extractions. The 8-nation alliance reached Beijing in August 1900, relieved the foreign legations that had been under siege, and proceeded to occupy the capital with a thoroughness that made the Allied action of 1860 look restrained by comparison. The Forbidden City was entered. The imperial quarters were searched. Soldiers of 8 nations moved through spaces that had been closed to foreigners since their construction, leaving evidence of their passage in forms that the subsequent inventory would record with the flat language of official damage assessment. Cixi fled Beijing for the second time in 40 years, dressed, according to accounts, as a peasant woman, in a cart moving west through the summer heat, while the capital she had governed for 4 decades was occupied by the armies of the powers whose treaties she had spent those decades managing. She would return the following year, having negotiated the Boxer Protocol, an indemnity of 333 million taels of silver, to be paid over 39 years with interest, the largest indemnity China had yet been required to absorb, drawn from a treasury that had been paying indemnities in various forms and to various parties for 60 years. The dynasty had 11 years left. In those 11 years, Cixi finally implemented many of the reforms she had suppressed in 1898, abolishing the examination system, establishing modern schools, beginning the process of constitutional government that Guangxu's reformers had proposed and she had ended. The reforms came too late to save the dynasty and too early to be fully implemented before it fell. They were, in their timing, a demonstration of the Qing state's fundamental problem. It could understand what needed to be done, and it could do it, but only after the moment at which doing it would have made the decisive difference had passed. Cixi died in November 1908, having the previous afternoon arranged for the Emperor Guangxu, her prisoner of 10 years, her nephew, the man whose reforms she had stopped, to be poisoned. Modern forensic analysis of his remains, conducted a century later, confirmed arsenic at levels inconsistent with natural causes. She died the following day, which she had apparently intended, leaving the throne to a 2-year-old boy named Puyi, and the management of an empire that had been diminished beyond recovery to a regency that had 3 years before the army revolted. The provinces declared independence, and the dynasty that had governed China since 1644 ceased to exist on the 12th of February, 1912. The Bainan Gorqi was not over. It had decades remaining. But its beginning, the ship, the holds, the manifest that listed cotton and wool and lead, was now far enough in the past that it had acquired the particular quality of origins. Not a memory, exactly. Something more durable than memory. The kind of knowledge that a nation carries in its institutions and its language and its political reflexes long after the people who lived through it are gone. The knowledge of what was taken, who took it, and what it cost to get any of it back. The archive does not forget. That is the only thing it has never needed to be taught. The ship that started all of this has no name in the record. There were hundreds like it, moving through the Pearl River estuary in the years before the wars, before the treaties, before the phrase Bainan existed to describe what they had set in motion. They came and went and left no individual mark on the archive beyond the aggregate of what they carried and what that carrying produced. The clerk who stamped their manifests is also unnamed. The customs official who did not check the holds is unnamed. The first man in Canton who accepted the first chest from the first night boat on the first Delta channel that the company's network had identified as reliable, unnamed. History remembers the commissioners and the emperors and the lords with portfolios. The mechanism by which they became necessary is distributed across thousands of ordinary transactions conducted by ordinary men, whose names the archive did not consider worth keeping. This is how most destruction works. Not as a decision made in a single room by a single hand, but as the accumulated outcome of 10,000 smaller decisions, each one defensible in isolation, each one contributing to a result that no individual decision-maker was required to name or claim or fully understand. The farmer in Bihar who accepted the advance did not consider himself an instrument of imperial policy. The clerk in Calcutta who recorded the auction lot did not consider himself complicit in the ruin of Chinese families he would never meet. The soldier on the Nemesis who watched the war junks burn in 9 minutes did not consider himself the executor of a plan that had begun in the ledgers of the East India Company 30 years before he was born. They were each doing what the system around them made available and rewarded and defined as normal. The system had a shape. The shape had consequences. The consequences had names, though most of those names are also not in the record. What is in the record is the outcome. A civilization that had governed itself continuously for longer than most of the nations that humiliated it had existed was, by 1912, a republic that controlled almost none of the conditions of its own sovereignty. The treaty ports remained. The indemnities continued to be paid. The foreign legations flew their flags in the capital. The opium moved through legal channels into a population where, by the most conservative estimates, 1 in 10 adults was dependent on it. The examination system was gone. The institutional backbone of a meritocracy that had, for all its failures, produced the administrators who had kept a civilization of 400 million people functioning for 2,000 years, replaced by something new that had not yet had time to prove whether it was better or merely different. The dynasty was gone. The certainty that had made the dynasty possible, the certainty that China was the center, that the world came to it, that the gate controlled what entered, was gone in a way that could not be restored by any subsequent government, regardless of its ideology or its competence or its determination. What remained was the memory, not as sentiment, as architecture. Built into the political language, the diplomatic reflexes, the specific texture of how China understands its relationship to the outside world, and what it believes the outside world is capable of, given sufficient opportunity and insufficient resistance. The Bainan Guoqi formally ended in the Chinese political calendar in 1997, with the return of Hong Kong, the barren island that Palmerston had dismissed, the island that 155 years of development had made into one of the most valuable pieces of real estate on Earth, returned on the 1st of July in a ceremony that the Chinese government had been planning in some form since before most of the people who watched it were born. The handover was conducted with considerable ceremony. The British flag came down. The Chinese flag went up. The last British governor left by sea, which was noted. The bronze animals of the zodiac continue to return. Slowly, through auctions and negotiations and the particular diplomatic pressure that a nation with sufficient economic weight can apply to the institutions holding objects it considers stolen: the rat, the rabbit, the ox, the tiger, the horse, the rooster, the monkey, the pig, the snake, the sheep, the dragon, the dog, piece by piece across decades, back toward a country that never stopped counting which ones were missing. Each return is an event. Each is covered extensively in the Chinese press and noted briefly in the foreign press, a disproportion that reflects, with some precision, the difference between what the objects mean to the people who lost them and what they mean to the people who are giving them back. The ruins of the old summer palace remain open to visitors. The broken stone columns of the Baroque fountains, the Jesuit contribution, the foreign element that outlasted the fire, stand in a park north of Beijing, where people walk in the mornings and children occasionally climb the fragments and are told to come down. The site is maintained as a patriotic education base. Signs explain what happened there and when and who was responsible. The explanation is not wrong. It is also not complete. No sign at a ruin is ever complete, but it is consistent, and it is repeated, and it reaches every generation of Chinese schoolchildren who visit, which is most of them, which is the point. The ship with no name moved into the Pearl River estuary and changed the world. Not because it was extraordinary, because it was ordinary, one of hundreds, operating inside a system that had been built carefully and maintained efficiently and never required any individual participant to understand the whole of what they were part of. The world it changed is still being changed by what it set in motion. The treaties are gone. The ports are Chinese. The flag is down. The memory is not a memory. It is a posture. The particular way a nation holds itself when it knows, from experience rather than theory, what the alternative to strength looks like, and has decided, with the quiet intensity of something decided over generations rather than in a single room, that it will not look like that again. The archive closes here. Not because the story ends, because this is where the weight becomes yours to carry. Thank you for staying through all of it. 20 parts is a long time to sit with something difficult, and you stayed. That means something, not to an algorithm, not to a metric. To this place, which exists because someone believed that history told slowly, told honestly, told without looking away, is worth the time it takes to tell it. If there is a story you think belongs in this archive, a silence that should be broken, an event that deserves 20 parts of honest attention, leave it in the comments. The archive is listening. It always has been. That is the only reason any of this exists.